as they are today, advocating on behalf of their fellow Jews, in part because of everything you've mentioned here. In some way, did this boycott feed into German Nazi notions about Jewish power?
That was the power of the boycott. You never measure a boycott in nickels and dimes or pfennigs and marks. You measure a boycott in ergs of fear.
Okay.
How afraid are you of the boycott?
And were they? Were the Germans?
The Nazis believed in Jewish boycotts. The Nazis believed in an international Jewish conspiracy which controlled money and markets. Adolf Hitler personally lionized his hero. Who was his hero? Henry Ford. And what brought Henry Ford down? A Jewish boycott run by the American Jewish Committee and B'nai B'rith and the Congress against the Ford Motor Company, and this was vividly in the minds of the Nazis. So the Nazis believed in the boycott almost as much as the boycotters believed in the boycott. If anyone comes to you with statistics, they don't know what they're talking about, because it's fear, it's economic fear that ruled the economy and the relations.
So how does this transfer agreement play into that backdrop of the boycott?
Without the boycott, the Nazis would have seen no necessity to work with the transfer agreement. So in that way, the boycott succeeded. To
kind of like succumb and go around it, so to speak.
That's right. By subverting the boycott, they could do the transfer agreement. The transfer agreement succeeded because it did bring the Jews out of Germany into Palestine, created a Jewish state, and had that not occurred, no one has a doubt what would have been the fate of those Jews.
Were there other areas of cooperation, by the way, between the Nazis and Palestine at that time?
Yes, there were. There were undercurrents.
Economic cooperation?
Yes, none of this is simple. This was complex, and that's why I spent 5 years putting it all together. Jewish Palestine was half agrarian, if not mostly agrarian, at that time in 1930s. The Jews did not own much of the land, which they did buy with transfer agreement money. They did not have a big infrastructure, but they had farms. And what was the biggest product?
I'm going to guess oranges, was it?
Oranges was the big product of Jewish Palestine. It was the economic wherewithal. Who was the #1 customer for oranges from Jewish Palestine? Nazi Germany. So now Jewish Palestine, which was, of course, abruptly surprised on January 30th with the takeover by Adolf Hitler, Jewish Palestine is now looking at their #1 customer, which is the Third Reich, and if those oranges are not purchased, there can be no economic vitality for Jewish Palestine, and there was the constant threat by the Third Reich: we won't buy Jewish oranges from Palestine, we'll buy fascist oranges from Spain, Valencia's.
What were the dynamics of the transfer agreement? What was the essence of it?
Okay, it starts out with a Jew in Germany taking his money and putting it into a blocked account. The Jew would put his money into a blocked account, a Sperrkonto, and that account would be fundamentally a trustee account, and that would be run by this bank in Germany. Then they would sell goods. They would sell pipes. They would sell taxis. They would sell it in Palestine. They would sell it in Lebanon. They would sell it in Turkey. They had all different types of commercial distribution for German goods. When the money was made available, the money was deposited in a second bank. The name of that bank was the Anglo-Palestine Bank. The Anglo-Palestine Bank renamed itself after the State of Israel was established, and the name is now Bank Leumi. Same bank. Anglo-Palestine Bank would take that money, credit through an international clearinghouse, the German trust fund. The German trust fund would issue the foreign currency of 1,000 British pounds. a capitalist certificate would be given to the German Jew, and that German Jew would then come across, and in many times he came across with replicas of his own home. He came across with carpets. He came across with building materials. He came across with cars. He came across with musical instruments. And suddenly there was a massive German Jewish and infrastructural and economic infusion into Jewish Palestine. And I ran into an archivist in Israel who seemed to know where all the files were hidden. And I said to him, "How is it that you know so much about this?" He says, I was in the transfer agreement.
Wow.
And the word transfer in Hebrew is havara, which means transfer. Transfer Limited, Havara Limited, was the name of the overall company. And you must remember, this was encouraged by the Nazis, cooperated with by the Nazis, and the Nazis and the Zionists actually worked together because they had an intersecting interest. The Nazis wanted the Jews out of Germany. The Zionists wanted them into Palestine. The Nazis wanted to seize German assets, German Jewish assets. The Zionists wanted to save German Jewish assets, and the only way they could do it was by this transfer agreement.
Nazis were willing to work with Jews on this? Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
But their desire was to ultimately to exterminate the Jewish people. So was this before they had gone down that path, or it was serving their greater interest? Explain that to us a little bit.
It was actually Byron Sherwin from Spertus College who schooled me on the new approach to understanding both the reality and the perception of reality. And the perception of reality often dictates the real set of facts that occur on the ground and tumbling down the road. The Nazis saw working with the Zionists as the best, most expedient way to stop the boycott and to get the Jews out of Germany. Where were they going to go? They're going to go to Palestine. Now, there's another train of thought here. The Nazis believed in something called Völkisch thought. That means ethnic primacy.
Okay.
And they believed that the Germans had the Völkisch primacy in Europe, and they thought that the Jews needed to go to Palestine, quote, where they belonged. And so you had the fantastical idea of Goebbels and others publicly endorsing Jewish emigration to Palestine. The Nazis actually struck a coin with a Jewish star on one side and a swastika on the other. While all the Jewish organizations were shut down, the Zionists were allowed to maintain their operation and were allowed to grow.
Was this then a situation whereby the Jewish community and somehow was contributing to the Nazi efforts and helping to finance what it is that they wanted to be able to do?
Yeah.
And that must have been also one of the causes for such an explosive reaction to your book, right?
Yeah. It's a deal with the devil, not with the angels. It's a deal with the people who want to kill you. So basically, every time they rescued a Jew, they paid into the Nazi economy. And it's worse than that. I mean, there were many dynamics that I never even wrote about, but the Jews were compelled. The Jews were compelled to rescue Jews in this fashion.
It was a terrible choice to have to make.
It was a terrible choice that was thrust upon the Jews, but you do not, upon the Zionists, but you do not blame the hostage with the gun at their forehead. Did
the Zionists consult with anybody on this, or they just said, you know what, we've got to do this, and this is what we need to do? In other words, did they talk with the American Jewish Committee or Congress? I mean, I assume I know the answer. They just, went on their own. Is that right?
They didn't care about the American Jewish Committee.
Right.
In fact, Zionism was controlled out of London until this time. And by the time the transfer agreement came to the fore, the access point for Zionist authority had transferred to Jerusalem. And so the people on the ground in Jerusalem were making decisions. And they weren't just taking anyone on a first-come, first-served basis. They were actually concomitantly building the state of Israel. And so consequently, they took the people who had a chance of surviving in Jewish Palestine, not just anyone.
When we've used this term, the Zionists, that's the Zionist leaders, the Jewish nationalists. Any particular leaders that we know of who were involved in advocating for this?
Yes, the entire Jewish agency.
We're talking David Ben-Gurion.
We are talking about another gray, not black and white fabric. Just as I said, the American Jewish community was divided between these two different blocks.
In the Zionist community also there were
The Zionist community was also not monolithic. There was what was called at that time the Labor Party, the Mapai Party.
Sure.
You're talking about people like Ben-Gurion. You're talking about a guy by the name of Chaim Arlazarov. Sure. Everybody who's been to Israel has been down the street called Arlazarov.
Absolutely right.
And Arlazarov was the chief engineer of this agreement, and he was murdered for it on the beach in Tel Aviv at the location where the Hilton now stands in Tel Aviv.
Sure.
Right there. There was no Hilton there at that time, and he was killed presumably by the followers of the dissident Zionist faction, and that dissident Zionist faction was led by a group associated with Menachem Begin, but really associated with Jabotinsky.
The revisionists.
And they called themselves revisionists, and the term revisionist at that time meant we have a new idea for Zionism, and these were the fighting Zionists. These were the Zionists who said, we want to fight Hitler, we don't want to have a deal with him. And consequently, as the Jewish community was torn apart on the subsuming and subverting the boycott, the Zionist community was fighting. They had riots, they had contentious votes. They were tearing their hearts out, saying, how can we cut a deal with these Nazis? Because right now it's common to say the Nazis weren't thinking of extermination. I've gone into the record. My first use of the word, my first common use of the word extermination in Nazi literature goes back to 1933. And that's because that was the word they used in World War I to exterminate the Armenians, was extermination. So consequently, it was a word of parlance of the day, and the Zionists completely expected everything that happened because they had a complete grasp on Jewish history, on the worthlessness of Jewish life at the hands of murderers. They had seen many, many Jews die in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world.
So I want to fast forward now. We're talking about the controversy that occurred then. We're talking about the